problem players. What do you do with them? Let's talk about that today. Lots of people play RPGs like D&D as a way to have fun with their friends, cope with stress, and try to get out of the grind of their daily lives. During the last 2 years, more people than ever seem to have joined the hobby, and that's awesome. If you're new here, welcome. However, these new players have started to become aware of the issue that has existed since RPGs first started being played. What do you do when there's a problem with a player at your table? This may be a sensitive subject for some of you, and with good reason. Arguments and fights between players or the GM can lead to some uncomfortable situations, disrupting games, or maybe even ending friendships. So, talking about what to do when a problem has developed at your table is important. Sure, the players and the GM are all playing characters and acting in ways that they probably don't during their day-to-day. Playing D&D does not mean, though, that anybody has the right to be an unreasonable jerk. If you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation because of another player or a GM, you have every right to leave, because GMs can be jerks too. But back to the matter at hand. I don't like the phrase problem player, because it means there's something wrong with the player only. To me, that can be a pretty tricky thing because interpersonal conflict usually has two or more sides. In most cases, a player group exists as a system. And because I like to look at things like this, like with a mental health angle, unlike as a counselor, when I say system, I'm talking about the relationships that exist between the players, their characters, and the game master. There are lots of different areas for potential conflict, so these different systems are represented in something called first and second order cybernetics. Not the cool robotic limbs that you might see in like Shadowrun, Cyberpunk, or Ghost in the Shell. We're talking about the cybernetics in group dynamics, the study of cybernetics in systems theory. It's like a really vast and complicated thing, so I'm not gonna go over like all of it, but dipping your toes into the pool of cybernetic systems and group dynamics can kind of help me better to explain the type of disruptive stuff that can make the games less fun. There are two major forms of cybernetic systems that people think about in regards to family therapy. And then we're gonna get to the RPG stuff, but stick with me. First order cybernetics dictates that a family unit is a closed system, kind of like a fish tank. The family interacts with each other, and their patterns of communications and miscommunications create problems, successes, alliances, divisions. Their system is closed, just like fish swimming around in a tank. No new fish ideas in, no old fish ideas out. This type of closed-off situation creates something called homeostasis, or the status quo, or normal. This normality means that if a family has a problem, it's assumed that those problems are their normal, because like if your parents have always been controlling, it's not out of the ordinary when they continue to be controlling, no matter how weird or dysfunctional that might look to an outsider. When a counselor is inserted into the equation for something like family therapy, first order cybernetics says that they are an external part of that closed family fish tank. They're apart from it, with their own versions of what normal or homeostasis is. This professional distance is supposed to help the counselor remain objective and be able to observe the family interaction from a distance. One of the problems with this, according to Steve DeShazer, is that homeostasis fit neatly into the clinical concept of resistance, or resistance to change. It assumes that a family group with a status quo will resist any change that a counselor might suggest or offer because the counselor's ideas would attempt to change what normal is for that family. However, once that counselor enters into the conversation in an effort to change that family's level of homeostasis, they affect both the family's system and their own system. They become a larger combined system, the family and the counselor, at least according to the concept of second order cybernetics. I guess that would mean the counselor's part of the fish tank. See, the biggest difference between the two systems is that first order cybernetics assumes the counselor can maintain objectivity because they're separate from the family. Second order cybernetics assumes that once the counselor begins their interactions with the family group, they become a part of it, not like in the immediate family way, but more in like an extended sharing ideas kind of way. Because their ideas are creating disruptions to the group's status quo, the second order assumes that the counselor can't keep their own judgments and assumptions separate from their interactions with the family. This isn't because the counselor is incompetent, it's just that they're human, and humans always are taking and adjusting and like modifying information and developing new thoughts and ideas. So if we switch up the script a little bit and think about how a normal D&D or RPG group interacts at the table, you can see that we're really talking about second order cybernetics. The GM is a part of the group and can't remain separate. The way they behave matters just as much as any of the players, because the GM has a direct impact on how the player characters interact with one another. This isn't just for the GM either. Players come to the game as fully formed people. If I sit down at a table to play a barbarian, for example, I still have obligations that are going to cross my mind during the game that are separate from my character. Things like my job, my family, my bills, things like that just don't vanish when I sit down to play. So if a player's having a bad day or a good day, it affects the way they're going to play during the session, which is going to have an effect on the group. If I'm normally playing my barbarian as someone with a shouty Boston accent, oh man, did you see the look on that elf's face when I headbutted his sister? It was wicked awesome. And I show up to a session and I barely say anything at all, it affects the status quo, because the other people at the table are going to notice that something is different with me. There's nothing wrong with that, it just means that the players are human and they notice changes to their environment. So what does all this mean for the proverbial problem player? Are they just having a bad day and they should get a pass? Well, maybe. RPG groups are as varied as the people that play them. Some groups are all about that raw experience and follow every little rule, and other groups are a lot more free-flowing and hardly roll any dice, like, ever. In my experience, conflict usually occurs at a table when people are getting together for the first time or when a new player is introduced. In those cases, the group hasn't established what normal looks like yet. They haven't reached homeostasis. Each player comes to the game with their own sense of what a normal game looks like to them. As the game begins and players see how each other play their characters, each player gets dropped into the fish tank and a cybernetic system begins to form. Each person affects the system with their own experiences and personalities. As people learn more about each other, they see how everyone fits, or doesn't fit, their expectations of what they thought the game world would be like. When expectations aren't met and conflicts happen between players, sometimes people get labeled as problem players. So in order to help your group get a handle on potential problems before they start, there are a few things that I've found to be helpful, because if you can head off problems before they begin, you can ensure that your group is able to develop a more comfortable sense of normal a little more quickly. One of the best ways to do this is to be upfront about what kind of table and group you want to create or be a part of. There's no one way to play games like D&D that's going to be better than every other one. Every group develops their own style, and that's cool. So having a conversation with all the players and the GM to help make sure that you all want the same things out of a game can really only benefit everyone involved. A lot of this starts from questions you can ask yourself. What kind of game do I like? If you've never played before, what kind of stories do I like? You can take this kind of self-awareness with you when you meet your group. Knowing yourself and what you're okay with at the table also lets you know when something doesn't feel right. Feeling or expressing those ideas isn't something bad. Having awareness of those expectations can help you be more comfortable if you're about to get into a situation like talking with a disruptive player and trying to address a problem. If you aren't sure what's over the line for yourself, how are you going to know when someone crosses that line? One way to accomplish this at your table is to develop a set of group norms to help roll that status quo snowball down the hill. I've talked about some tools to help make this work before, but I always like to recommend the book Consent in Gaming. You can check out my review on it, and it's completely free, the book and the review. But the back of the book contains something called the Consent Checklist. This checklist allows the whole group to learn what is and is not acceptable in a real, referenceable way. If you think the consent checklist might be a bit much for your group, consider agreeing to something like a rating of the game before you all leap into the story. Sometimes having a group agree that the game is going to be PG-13 or T for teen can help people wrap their minds around what to expect. In my experience, when I'm the GM, I've typically been the leader of my table. So it's generally assumed that I'm in charge when the game is on and that any issues or conflicts between players are mine to take care of. While I know that not every group functions this way, I'm going to operate on the assumption that other GMs work similarly enough so that these will be some referenceable points. There can be a lot of behaviors that rub GMs and players the wrong way. Maybe a player's talking over everyone. Maybe they're playing a game on their phone. Maybe they're insulting all the work you or another person put into their character. You might think, all right, you want to be like that? Maybe the guard shows up and arrests you, or maybe a tree branch falls out of the sky. Stop, like right there, stop. For starters, punishing characters for a problem you have with a player won't fix anything. Let me say that one more time. Punishing characters for problems you have with their players won't fix anything. Doing things like removing inspiration, attacking them in game, or calling them out in front of the whole group can lead to escalation, which generally leads to wasted time for the whole group. Oftentimes, having a conversation in private after the game can yield better results towards a compromise than immediate confrontation and eventual escalation. Because sometimes people are going to see public confrontation as a challenge or a threat. When people feel threatened, they can do and say some pretty unpredictable things. This could cause them to double down on poor behavior or even accuse the rest of the group of bullying them, and sometimes this might even lead to the player leaving. Players come to games for all different kinds of reasons, and if your players are your friends out of game, this can be really hard. Having open and honest communication with your friends about anything, let alone what they're doing wrong, is really freaking hard, but being honest is always worth it. And this leads me to how I like to deal with issues between players in the game. In order to deal with a player causing problems, you need to know about it first. Sometimes you can see it coming from a mile away as a GM, you get annoyed by a player, you can see the other players at the table making that meaningful eye contact with you. But sometimes it can go unnoticed. If a party member comes to you and complains about another person, it's really important that you listen to what they have to say. No matter why they've come to you, it's important to listen seriously and with as little judgment as possible. If you can try just to hear what's going on, you can hopefully begin to get a more clear picture. And some players feel like it's only up to the GM to solve everything. Every GM's different, and I've got training and experience de-escalating conflict. You may not, so it's unreasonable to think that every GM should feel comfortable dealing with conflicting things like angry players or problematic behavior. If you need to ask for help or guidance from someone else, like another GM or a friend, if you think it's going to be helpful, go for it. There's nothing wrong with asking for help trying to address a specific problem. Sometimes an outside perspective can help clarify what's going on and maybe even clarify your position. Because it's important to avoid falling into the trap and the idea that you need to fix somebody. That's not your job. People are complex animals, and most of the time there's no fix for a person about anything. Think about it. When was the last time you really were able to change somebody's mind about anything they disagreed with you on? If you approach a disruptive player from an open point of view, at the very least you can begin to understand some of their motivations instead of immediately assuming you're in the right. This type of listening requires a ton of empathy, and it can be really hard. I also want to say that most of these suggestions you simply can't just implement. You need to practice them, just like you'd practice the piano, karate, or swimming. It takes time to learn to do any of this well. Sometimes, if there's an issue between the players, it's just up to them to sort it out. However, if you do ask them to deal with the issue on their own, ask them to deal with it out of the game. But if you choose to help resolve an issue and step in as the leader, direct communication to a disruptive player, not their character, is the most effective way to begin resolving conflict. Also, I try not to think of this player as resistant. That phrase, resistant, sets up an adversarial situation right from the jump. If you're thinking of somebody as resistant, then that means you're already assuming you're in the right. Oftentimes, a player that's caused problems doesn't feel like they've done anything wrong. They might feel misunderstood or maybe even like they're being picked on. This can be especially true if the problems at the table have been going on for a long time. If a player's been causing problems for a bunch of sessions, then they're confronted with a pile of complaints they didn't know about, they're probably gonna feel attacked. So when a problem starts at your table, it's important to address it soon and as quickly as you feel like you can. If you get the chance, try to engage with the player before or after the session. This can give them a chance to process information before the next game. It can also help to establish a better relationship with that player, as strange as it might sound. If they see you approaching the situation with a desire to help instead of just judgment, it can help strengthen that relationship and build trust. Additionally, use your best judgment in these situations. If you want to keep a player in your game and you're taking the time to have a conversation with them, think about why you're doing it. Is it because you feel obligated to, or do you really want them to stick around? Examining your own motivations as a game master can help you understand why you want to have a difficult conversation. Sometimes having that conversation with a player is totally worth it, and sometimes it's okay just to say goodbye. Sometimes the writing on the wall is just that clear. So with that in mind, here are some of the typical issues that I've dealt with over the years. Like I said at the beginning, I don't really like the phrase problem player. It feels reductive, and the person being hit with it probably won't agree. So that being said, I really only have one type of player who I will take a very firm stance with. They're called the danger. If I find someone at my table who's acting bigoted, prejudiced, sexually inappropriate, or generally making the other players or me feel unsafe, I'm gonna shut that down. If I can, I'll try to do it in private, but if they're being hurtful to other people, I'll shut it down in game. Sometimes it's a simple, that's not okay. And sometimes it's time for you to go. If it gets to that point, I'm gonna try to follow up with that player, but if someone's being abusive, it's a non-starter. The rest of these are actually not what I would consider to be problem players. I'd consider these to be players that I would need to have conversations with. You might recognize some of these labels because they're used by the role-playing community at large, and I think that's a mistake. But I'm gonna use them here because it could help you recognize a situation at your own table. So let's start with the method actor. Sometimes the player might feel like they're doing a good job playing their character the way they see most appropriate. You might hear them use the phrase, "That's what my character would do," before they steal someone's coin purse or push a guard off a bridge. Thing is, they might be being disruptive to the rest of the party, they just might not realize it. My advice is to talk to them and try to figure out where their motivations are coming from. Like I said, they might not know that they're being disruptive, and most of the time when I talk to these players, they're very receptive to the conversation, because if they're trying to play their character that deeply, then they probably want to keep playing the game and they can't resolve conflicts they don't know about, so having a conversation is important. The Rulebook is the type of player who's going to disrupt the game because the rules are not being observed as they are written. In most cases, people that can quote the rules are actually a tremendous asset to your game. These are players who have taken the time to read the rules and are injecting themselves because they care about how the game progresses. If you find yourself being on the wrong side of them, it might be a good idea to talk with them and explain any house rules in advance or differences in game types that they should expect. They're focused on the rules and they want to follow them, so while it might feel like you need to match their wits rule for rule, it's not worth it. Honestly, I love these kind of players. If I don't know the answer in a certain situation, I can usually just ask them, but just be clear about the expectations you have with how certain situations are going to be resolved and how you'd like to handle rule disputes and interruptions. If you end up goofing a rule and they call you on it, just ask that it gets resolved incorrectly that one time in order to keep the game going, and do your best to remember to correct the rule for all future situations where the rule's going to come up. They want to play the game too. They just put their focus on a really specific aspect of the process. So, metagamers are players who are using out-of-game information to resolve issues in-game. Lots of players have stuff pop up in-game that actually require a certain amount of metagaming, like planning on how to attack a big bad guy, or develop a strategy in a certain situation, or figure out a puzzle. Metagamers are players who I do like to take aside and explain what metagaming is, because usually this person is somebody who's inexperienced with RPGs. These players aren't problems in my experience, they just need to have some more seat time in the game to figure out what kind of information they can and cannot use. The rules lawyer. This one seems to pop up pretty frequently. The rules lawyer is a rulebook player, but instead of wanting to instruct the GM or other players on the rules, they'll try to manipulate the rules to their favor. A rules lawyer is someone who has spent a great deal of time learning the rules because they care about the game and they want to control the outcome of most situations. If this particular player is consistently interrupting me for corrections or to challenge a rule, I usually try to have a conversation with them after the game to talk about how I like to resolve rules conflicts. I found that talking to them about maintaining the flow of the game and ensuring that other players get to keep the game going too without negotiating about rules has a positive result. If it keeps coming back up, then we can have further conversations, but for the most part, I want to make sure that I'm clear about how I like to keep the flow of the game moving and try to figure out where they're at too. Once we can come to some kind of compromise, everything usually sorts itself out. This is a kind of player who can benefit from being given a job, honestly. Maybe they're the person that people can defer to on rules issues. Maybe pair them up with inexperienced players to help them learn the ropes of how best to play the game or optimize their characters. The Limelight, or Drama Queen, or Attention, I'm not saying that, is usually the one who tries to steal the attention of the game master from the other players. You might hear phrases like, "I stopped them," when another player is trying to do something, or "I'm there too," when they just spent 10 minutes taking their character to the other side of town. It might be annoying, but it's usually pretty easy to address. What I like to do is even out the amount of attention that I have with the other players by engaging specifically with other players and specific NPCs. Sometimes it's just helpful to redirect the attention in-game in order to help the Limelight player know, yes, there are other players there too. And honestly, it's been really helpful in those situations because sometimes the Limelight player gets new ideas that they want to play whenever it's their turn to be in the spotlight again. But if the player continues to interrupt these interactions, intentionally or not, I try to have a conversation with them about sharing the stage. One way I've framed conversations like this in the past is to explain that it's more fun to act as a big character when there's other big characters to act with. And the only way that's going to happen is if they share the spotlight. In my experience, a lot of people come to D&D from the theater, and their level of normal is to have their big personality matched by another big personality. But not everyone at the table has that level of confidence and bravado. If you can have an honest conversation with this player and try to help reframe expectations, I found this to be pretty helpful. Also, I found that lots of people who fall into this particular category eventually make great game masters. They're able to jump in and out of characters, so if you feel up to it, you may want to talk with them about learning how to take the reins as a game master as well. Ah, cheaters. I don't really understand why people cheat in D&D. It's like cheating on a driving test. You're only gonna end up hurting yourself. Much like the rules lawyer, the cheater is just trying to control the outcome of whatever situation they're in. Usually this is done by lying about the result of a die roll. You might hear it called fudging by some folks. I know I'm in the minority, but honestly, it doesn't really bug me that much. As a game master, I try to be able to adapt to any outcome that my players are capable of producing. If I have a player who doesn't want to leave things up to chance, okay, fine, that's not really gonna bug me because I can come up with ways to raise the difficulty that don't require dice rolls. However, if that player starts cheating against other players, that's where I draw the line. Lots of people don't like cheaters, and I get it. They aren't playing by the same rules as other players, and that makes a ton of sense. So when I know about somebody cheating, I'll do a couple of different things. I'll ask the players, like all the players, to roll on the table in front of everybody, and it makes cheating a lot harder. And the second option really only works for D20 systems like D&D or Pathfinder, but a way to reduce cheating is to ask all the players to give me a dozen or so D20 rolls on a sheet of paper at the beginning of each session. Then when it comes time for a roll, I can ask them for their modifier and add it to the first roll that the players gave me. Then I'll tell them what the result was. I'll tick the number off and just keep moving on down the sheet. Sure, this might mean you need to do more mental math, but it's just another option and you can have it work well if you have a group playing online, I've found too. If you find that somebody's making up the results of their rolls, talk to them after the session. Don't do it in front of everybody and just ask them, hey, are you using the right rolls? They might say yes, they might say no. If it's worth getting into an argument about, then that's up to you. But to me, having control over a situation in a role-playing game by fudging dice rolls isn't really that big of a deal, but your mileage may vary. The min-maxer, or the power gamer, is not an inherently poor player. In fact, they're usually really competent in the rules and know how to build a character or to create a super powerful, sometimes game-breaking effect. The difficulty that can come from them is the potential to steamroll almost every combat challenge or social situation that might arise. To me, this player is looking at a game of D&D like a math problem or a competition, and they had that game knowledge to win those things. There's nothing inherently wrong with playing D&D like this. In fact, min-maxers usually push me as a GM. They show the weak spots in my plans and make me put real thought into how I'm going to try and challenge the party. Where the min-maxer can become problematic is when they take the spotlight away from all the other players so they don't get a chance to do anything. If this starts to become an issue, my usual approach is, again, a private conversation. I let them know that I'm concerned with the other players not getting a chance to flex their characters that much. This usually helps as long as they're approached with a constructive attitude and not a punitive one. More of a, hey, here's what's going on, and I want your help to fix it, instead of, here's what you're doing wrong. Also, the min-maxer might just be playing the game the way they play other games, especially video games. In something like Dragon Age or WoW, stats matter so much. The difficulty of beating certain bosses has so much to do with damage output, and the only way to get there is to min-max your character. RPGs aren't all like that, and helping this player to understand that numbers may not matter as much at your table can really help to clear up some of those issues. The ne'er-do-well, otherwise known as the murder hobo, is the player who seems to want to disrupt play almost because they can. At every opportunity, they're attacking other players, stealing party loot, and being generally abusive in character. This player is different to me than the danger player because the danger is having issues as a player as opposed to the ne'er-do-well causing issues as a character. I find that I actually have very few issues with this type of character and player because when I'm asking my players to create their characters, I'm always very careful to ask my favorite question. Why is your character willing to join a party? This assumptive question almost always prevents a ne'er-do-well from popping up. But if I do have a player who's playing a disruptive character, I almost always have a conversation with them at a game and ask what their motivation is for their character's behavior. Oftentimes, these players don't even realize they're being disruptive and the issue isn't a problem anymore. If it continues to be an issue though, then I remind them that their behavior in-game usually is going to have in-game consequences. Stole everything from the store? Have some guards. Murdered all the guards? Have a massive price on your head. If everyone else at the table is on board for the misadventures this player's creating, I usually don't have a problem following down this particular rabbit hole. But if they keep pulling the story away from the other players and they're hell-bent on causing as much chaos as possible, regardless of what the rest of the party wants, it's time for a more serious conversation about what they're looking for at my table. The Overlord is a player who usually has more table time experience than any other player. This wouldn't normally be a bad thing, except the Overlord usually ends up telling other players how to play their characters. They may even get upset if people don't listen to them. To me, any player that's trying to control other players is usually doing so because they feel like they have the correct answers. The best advice I have for anyone who might be a new GM and has a player at their table who might have a lot more experience than them is to try and find a good time for a conversation and remind that player that they were new once too. When that player was new, maybe they had someone telling them what to do. Maybe they hated it. Maybe they didn't. Either way, all players learn at their own speed, and while it's okay to offer suggestions, it's not okay to demand obedience. Nobody likes their free will taken away, especially for a game that's as open as D&D. Giving them a chance to realize that they're not in the driver's seat might be difficult, but being clear in your expectations and what the table might have already agreed to is very important. The inattentive player, or the watcher, is someone who takes up a space at your table and doesn't really interact. They might play on their phone or just generally drift off. I don't really see this player as a problem player. However, inattentive players are the types I get the most questions about. When I was at PAX this year, I had no less than 3 people ask me, I've got this one player at my table who doesn't do anything. How do I fix that? And here's what I always try to say. If this person is taking a back seat, it's okay. Sometimes people are shy or new to the game. If they're willing, I try to involve this player a little more each session. Starting small, and when they do interact, I try to give them my complete and undivided attention. Asking them questions and providing small interactions with NPCs is a good place to start sometimes. But I try not to overdo it. The last thing this person needs is to feel bad for taking a passive approach. Because if there's one thing that never works, it's shaming somebody for being shy and disengaged, and then expecting them to become less shy and disengaged. However, sometimes a player may not have their head in the game. If that happens, I usually follow up after the session and address it. Just a little, hey, you good? You didn't seem like you were all there tonight. Sometimes they may just not know what to do at the table, or, and this is pretty common too, they may just be there for somebody else. I've met plenty of people who were brought to the game by their significant other and are just going through the motions. If they don't want to play, that's fine. They're under no obligation to participate. So when that's the case, I usually ask the person how they feel about the game. Did they have a good time? What could we do differently next time? Make sure the questions are open, and when they answer, listen to what they say. You might be surprised. They may actually really want to be there, but they're overwhelmed. Or they may just say they're present because so-and-so brought them along. If that's the case, I let them know that my table's open to them, but if they don't want to be there, then they may want to have that conversation with the significant other that brought them along. So, to wrap things up, problem players aren't bad people. They're just people. Labeling them as problematic doesn't help you resolve issues. It affects the homeostasis of the group and can make problems worse between the GM and the players. As a game master, it can feel really easy to focus up on people's faults and reduce them down to that flaw. But if you think about the level of normal that you and your players are looking for at the table, then you can get a clear idea of what players should expect and get ahead of any issues that could arise. Because the GM and the players are an interactive group. Everyone brings their own flair to their characters and interactions. If we can be honest with each other, then we can get to the things that matter most. Having fun, telling a story, and making friendships. So that's all I've got. Thanks so much for watching. I know that this episode might have brought up more questions than it answered, but if you have anything you'd like to add or feel like I missed anything, you can leave it here in the comments section or over on my Instagram or Twitter account at Tabletop Theory 1. If you're watching this video and you'd like to see more like it, thanks. Please hit the subscribe button and take a look over at the other videos I've made where I get to talk about other ways to step your game up with counseling and educational theory. If you'd like to support this channel, you can hit the like button so that the big algorithm bot that we all serve knows I did a good job. And if you really, really liked this video, you can leave a donation over on my Buy Me a Coffee account or become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. And as always, a huge thank you to the supporters who have donated in the past. You all are amazing, and every dollar you donate goes right back into making more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. It's been another year, and we're about to roll the clock over to 2022 in a few days. Time keeps going, and to me, that's a good thing. I know that 2021 was a tough year for me and a lot of other people, but hey, we did it! We made it to the end, and we're about to have all the opportunities that a new year's gonna bring. For me, I'll be starting some classes again to get ready to qualify for my professional counseling license. That's gonna be a ton of work, but I'm excited to do it. If you're getting ready to start a new adventure or continue one that you're already on, I wish you the best, and I hope that you're able to get where you wanna be. We're all on different journeys, and if we can support each other, they don't have to be as tough. So grateful for everybody's support this year, and all the best to you and yours in the new year. Take care, be kind, and have fun adventuring.